The webinar is being hosted by the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, IEEFA, as a side event of the T20 South Africa, an official engagement group of the G20. For those of you who are new to us, a quick word on IEEFA. We are a global energy finance think tank. Our work focuses on energy market, policies, and financial trends with the goal of accelerating sustainable and equitable energy transition, not just in India, but worldwide. My name is Saloni Sachdeva, and I'm a clean energy specialist at IEEFA, and it's truly my pleasure to be moderating the session today. To begin with, I'll briefly walk you through how we will spend the next 70 minutes. And a big thank you to all the panelists for joining us today. We will begin with a welcome address by Ms. Vibhuti Garg, Director, South Asia at IEEFA. After the welcome address, we will move straight into our panel discussion, where we will hear from our distinguished panelists joining us from the United States, Japan, Africa, and India. We are still awaiting from our panelist from Australia. We will bring in him as soon as he is here. Towards the end, we also have reserved 10 minutes for Q&A. I encourage all the participants and the attendees to please post their questions in the Q&A box at any point during the discussion. We will try to address as many of them as possible during the Q&A segment. Finally, we will close with concluding remarks by my colleague, Ms. Kaira Rakheja. Again, please note that the session is being recorded and the video will be available for use later on. To all the attendees, please feel free to use the chat box to share your comments and resources on the discussion topics that are being discussed today, and also the Q&A box specifically for the questions to the panelist. Please address your question to the specific panelist if you have that clarity. If not, also happy to have all the questions that you have. With that, I would now like to invite Ms. Vibhuti Garg to deliver the welcome address. Over to you, Vibhuti.
Thank you, Saloni, and a very good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to all of you joining us from across the world. I'm Vibhuti Garg, Director for South Asia at the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar on strategic partnerships for equitable and diversified critical mineral supply chains, the role of G20. We are really delighted to be engaging with all of you under the aegis of Think20, an official engagement group of the G20. This year, under the South African G20 presidency, the T20 has 5 dedicated task forces to mobilize climate action and enhance collaboration on SDGs. As 2025 marks the 10-year anniversary of the Paris Agreement, the Task Force 5, the Accelerating Climate Action and the Just Energy Transition in particular is looking to enhance action and cooperation towards inclusive and equitable development. This also includes ensuring these principles in the critical mineral supply chain, along with other things. Critical minerals such as lithium, graphite, nickel, manganese, and cobalt underpin the renewable energy, electric mobility, and green industrialization, with demand which is projected to rise from 3 million metric tons this year to 12 million by 2035. Their extraction and use must be governed in ways that promote fair value sharing, transparent supply chains, local value addition, and sustainable development. Today's discussion contributes directly to Task Force 5's mandate by examining how the G20 can help build equitable and resilient mineral value chains that support both climate goals and development priorities. The growing demand for these minerals creates opportunities not only for innovation and investment, but also inclusive growth. And especially this becomes very, very relevant for the global South. At the same time, it highlights the importance of strong governance, equity, and resilience in shaping future supply chain. For developing countries in particular, this offers the potential to move beyond extractive roles and unlock value through local industrial development. International partnerships and framework like those under the G20 will be critical to ensuring fair benefit sharing, local industrial development, and strong environmental and social safeguards. We are privileged to have today an excellent panel of speakers representing diverse roles across the critical mineral supply chain, who will not only help us explore inclusive models, but also will demonstrate some successful case studies and stronger frameworks for cooperation. As Saloni mentioned, we have members from Australia, Japan, United States, India, and South Africa. These countries reflect a balance between advanced and developing economies, as well as their distinct roles across the critical mineral supply chain. Over the next 70 minutes, we will hear from these different geographies as they are rich in different resource endowments and have different strengths, whether it's on processing and mining, but also in terms of, circular economy. Without further ado, I will hand it back to Saloni. And but before that, let me thank all the panelists for joining us today and all of you in the audience for taking the time to be part of this important discussion. We look forward to a rich exchange of insights and ideas. Thank you. Over to you, Saloni.
Thank you so much, Vibhuti, for setting the context and also highlighting the importance of today's discussion. Welcome, Mr. Sanjeeva, and I will set the context for the panel discussion and also introduce the panelist. May I first request all the panelists to please switch on their videos if they are comfortable with it. Thank you so much. As Vibhuti was saying, we truly have a distinguished group of experts with us today, and I really look forward to hearing their perspective on how strategic partnerships can shape equitable and diversified critical mineral supply chain. I don't think so. We need to emphasize on this. We all are well aware about how rapidly the growing demand for critical minerals is driven by global clean energy transition. And these resources are not only essential for clean energy technologies, but now are also reshaping geopolitics, trade, and also industrial policies. At the same time, producer countries, especially in the global south, risk being limited to low value extractive roles, along with bearing the environmental and the social implications of it. Having said that, as we speak, G20 under the South Africa presidency has been discussing a critical mineral framework to build a secure, transparent, and equitable supply chain. We all are aware that each and every country present here and beyond that have been launching their critical mineral list, their national strategies. But what is missing and is important is coordination at the global level, which is key. At IFA, we recognize that and appreciate that. In fact, we have been undertaking studies to understand what the missing elements within the Indian ecosystem are. We also undertook a report analysis last year, which is titled India's Hunt for Critical Minerals, highlighting India's high import reliance for at least meeting our domestic critical mineral needs. Currently, there exists approximately 100% of import dependency for minerals like lithium, cobalt, and nickel, and it also expands to supply of graphite and copper. This dependency has been highlighted further by the recent shocks we all are aware of, be it the China export restrictions on germanium, gallium, or the rare earth metals, the pandemic, and also the Russia-Ukraine conflicts. All of these demonstrates just how vulnerable the supply chains are, not just from a supply chain technical perspective, but also the geopolitical perspective. Today, this conversation is not just about minerals. And as Vibhuti said, it is about shaping the rules of the new clean energy economy. And with that context in place, I'm really excited to move into a panel discussion where our experts will share country level experiences, initiative, insights, and areas for collaboration. I will start with a quick round of introduction of our panelists, starting with you, Ms. Mehnaz Khan, who's the Vice President of Policy for Critical Supply Chains at Silverado Policy Accelerator. Mehnaz specializes in building policy frameworks for mineral partnership and has extensive experience in the US trade policy. She has more than 14 years of experience in working in the US Trade Department, International Trade Commission, and the Department for Commerce. It's a pleasure to have you. I know it's really early for you, so thank you for taking out the time to join us today. Next, we have with us Mr. Sanjeeva De Silva, Councillor, Energy and Resources, Australia High Commission, New Delhi. Mr. Silva leads Australia's bilateral energy, resources, and climate partnerships with India, including major initiatives on lithium, cobalt, renewable energy collaborations. He was instrumental in designing the Australia-India Renewable Energy Partnership launched back in November 2024. It's a pleasure to have you, Mr. Sanjeeva. Thank you so much for joining us. Moving on to the next person, which is Dr. Nanda Kumar Janardhan, Deputy Director of the Climate Change Unit at the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, Japan. He brings over 2 decades of experience in policy research and market analysis and has worked with leading think tanks in India and Japan. We really look forward to your insights from Japan today, Dr. Nanda. Next, we have Mr. Gaylor Montmason Clare, Director and co-founder of Southern Transitions, a think and do tank focused on just transition in the global south. He has worked extensively on sustainable industry policy, climate diplomacy, and the South Africa renewable energy value chain. Thank you so much for joining us today. Last but not the least, we have Mr. Vivek Chandran, co-founder Solutions for Sustainable Living. Vivek is a public policy specialist with over 15 years of experience at the intersection of climate change mitigation, clean energy transition, and sustainable development. He has worked closely in shaping India's critical mineral agenda, working with the NITI Aayog, the Ministry of Mines, domestic think tanks, and other government agencies. Welcome to the panel discussion, Vivek, today. I will just straight away begin with the discussion now, starting with you, Mehnaz. The United States, with its strong technology and industrial base, plays a key role in the critical mineral space. And we all know that historically, US has relied on imports for meeting its essential mineral requirements, and that exposes the United States to supply disruptions, geopolitical risk. However, with the establishment of the National Energy Dominance Council, aimed at boosting domestic production and also reducing the reliance on foreign resources, how, in your perspective, is the US approach to strengthening critical mineral supply chain? Could you cover like the entire value chain of the supply chain, be it extraction, processing and refining, and also recycling? Out of this value chain, what is US prioritizing, and do you see like any gaps and opportunities there?
Thank you, Saloni, and happy early morning from Washington here.
And a heavy question.
Regarding your question, I want to put it in 5 buckets, and you touched on some of them. So mining, processing, recycling, recovery, and innovation. So where we see a lot of traction with the US government is on the mining and processing side, but that's very domestic focus. And that was the reason why this National Energy Dominance Council came to be. It's actually a new agency within the White House. So on the mining side, we are looking in the United States at utilizing our own resources. So just yesterday, actually, there was an announcement made where we want to look at mining in Alaska, right? There's needs a lot of infrastructure and that sort of development. And there's a lot of emphasis on permitting reform in the United States for this. So we have a very, very long times for permitting. It can take up to 15 to 20 years. So this administration's focused on moving that timeline down. On the processing side, as you alluded to in your comments, there's this geopolitical factor with China putting all these export bans and export controls. Most recently, the one that really affected us was the one on rare earths, the export controls in April. So this kind of catalyzed us to focus on our rare earths magnet supply chain. So you probably heard of the MP deal where the government took a 10%, took an equity stake. There's a price floor for separated materials, and there's an offtake with the US government. So we see these kind of equity deals happening. We see another one with Lithium America. So it's not just in the rare earth supply chain, it's also extending to other minerals. When we're looking at policy gaps, it's really in those three last areas. It's on recycling, recovery, and innovation. And at Silverado, we've partnered with the Council on Foreign Relations to figure out what policy we need in this front. And it can be domestic and it can be international. So I think this is where the G20 can play, outside of China, but the G7 Critical Minerals Action Plan, those partners, including Australia, India, and Korea, who have also signed off on that action plan, can look at doing some of the policy here. On the recycling side, there's very small domestic recycling initiatives that were announced, the Department of Energy. Same thing on the recycling side, but there was an international announcement made with the US-India Strategic Partnership Forum, looking at ways to recover critical minerals. And then on the innovation side, I think that there's a huge opportunity there with these G20 partners, looking at producing AI mineral mapping, looking at substitutes for different types of batteries, and also looking at other compositions for rare earth or rare earth-free magnets. So I think that those are some areas that the G20, I mean, outside of China, should really look at.
Thank you so much, Minas, for those insights. I know I completely agree with you on the mining, processing, and refining. I think these are similar challenges that India is also facing. I think what I really found interesting is your comments on recovery and innovation, be it the AI mineral mapping or the rare earth free technologies going forward. And I know that Dr. Nanda would talk about this going forward. But just like we know, US has issues with the dependency on other countries in order to meet their supply chain. And the availability of reserves within the country is limited, or there is process happening in terms of enhancing the extraction and processing capability on the domestic side. But the situation is completely opposite in Australia. Australia is blessed with some of the world's largest reserves of lithium, cobalt, and rare earths. And in fact, the country has strong mining sector and transparent regulatory framework that positions Australia as a reliable supplier and a cornerstone for diversifying global supply chain. And in the last recent years, we have also seen how the Australian policy initiatives are now moving towards further downstream with the focus on moving beyond extraction and building processing capabilities. Mr. Sanjeeva, it would be great to know your view about how do you assess Australia's policy priorities that focus on moving beyond extraction, particularly in scaling processing capabilities, along with creating like domestic economic opportunities. And are there any partner countries where Australia would focus on in the coming years?
Thank you, Saloni, and thank you for inviting me to speak at this webinar. I'll take the first part of your question. What is the Australian government doing? I mean, we are an economy that is built on an openness to trade. You know, our economy has grown over the last 50 years very quickly by being very open to international trade. We have a fantastic trading relationship with countries like China and elsewhere in the world. But I think in more recent years, we have also discovered that there is this strategic element to a number of these initiatives, a number of these supply chains, and it's not enough for governments to simply open up borders to foreign investment and to foreign trade, that we need to think strategically about how our resources can value add in terms of the Australian economy, but also how we can help our like-minded trading partners also make sure that they have mineral security. In terms of what the Australian government is doing, our Prime Minister in April announced a critical minerals a strategic reserve. The kind of details of that are being still worked out in amongst our government, but we know that this reserve will be one that looks to make available to the Australian domestic industry the critical minerals that we have in abundance, as you mentioned, but also to like-minded trading partners, that we begin to hold some of our reserves in for these strategic needs. The details, as I said, are being worked out, but it's an important and major step for our country to be talking in that way. We also have a Future Made in Australia strategy. There's $27 billion that have been allocated by the Australian government basically to boost value addition onshore. $2 billion of that will be part of a critical minerals facility, and that will help help companies that are looking to value add to our critical minerals sector onshore. And finally, there's a production tax incentive that the government has announced, which would effectively processing facilities in the critical mineral space will get back 10% of the value of the facilities that they are investing in onshore. But all of that said, I think Australia is in no doubt that we need global markets in order to make these ambitions of adding more value to our resources realistic, we need to cooperate with like-minded partners. India is really well placed to help us do that because India is one of the few countries on earth that can rival China in terms of the magnitude of its future markets for things like batteries, things like solar panels and hydrogen electrolyzers and other things in the energy transition space. So we're working very closely with India. The Australian government has a critical minerals partnership with India where we are looking, core part of that is to support the Indian government to try and get its first investments into Australian critical minerals. As I said in the past, Australia has really left that up to the private sector, but we went above and beyond with our relationship with India in terms of investing in helping India do due diligence on a number of major projects across our country and to encourage India to try and make those investments. India progressed very far in a number of those commercial processes. We are still waiting to see whether any of them will be successful in actually securing that investment. That will be a major thing because a single country dominates much of the offtake for many of our critical minerals, including, for example, lithium. And it will be really important that if India gets access to lithium, for example, and lithium offtake in Australia, then India will need a pathway to process those minerals. And that's where partners like the US and others will become very important because even Australia and India alone won't be able to build these battery manufacturing supply chains by themselves. Just to describe one part of that, Australia is the world's largest exporter of lithium, but 95% of our lithium currently goes to China, and that lithium goes to China essentially unprocessed. So what we are trying to do is to partner with countries like India that are trying to move from simply assembling Chinese components in India to moving to cell production and even cathode active material production here in India. We are looking to partner with India on that, but we will need partners like the US and Korea, Japan, and others to help develop the technology that will allow that to happen. I'm happy to answer more questions, but I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sanjeev, for those insights. In fact, you already highlighted few answers to my follow-up questions. I completely agree with your fact that there is collaboration needed, and the India-Australia partnership will help strengthen and provide benefit sharing results to both the countries. India is looked as like the demand center for all these critical minerals, and also like a place where with our own Atmanirbhar Bharat and the domestic manufacturing ecosystem developing at a large pace as a hub for developing, processing, and refining technology capacity. And not just that, also looking into recycling. Having said that, Vivek, maybe I will now bring you in. There are vulnerabilities that Mr. Sanjeeva pointed out, and in fact, the ministry is taking efforts to address those with the launch of the National Critical Mineral Mission and also existing partnerships with resource-rich countries like Australia and Argentina. Could you help us highlight what concrete steps or policy levers is India prioritizing in terms of accelerating exploration, but also in parallel looking at secured offtake agreements with partner countries to reduce our import dependency of these critical minerals? And are these steps enough? If not, then what are we missing out?
Thanks, Aloni, and firstly, thanks for having me on this webinar. Great question, difficult one to answer, but I think in many ways this is a process, right? And India started off on this in all earnest, let's say somewhere around 2022 and 2023. So it's not been long that a lot of the reform measures have been, have been started. But this year we got the National Critical Minerals Mission, which is a $4 billion USD program over the next 5 to 6 years. So there is now almost, and this mission is an all of a government kind of approach, right? There's different parts of government reacting to this mission, although it's housed at the Ministry of Mines. Policy reform is up for grabs, finance is up for grabs, infrastructure development is there. there's skill development, there's a bunch of other ideas within this one large mission. So in many ways, this mission is the critical vehicle for India to get a lot of its security of critical minerals to be ensured. And I would maybe highlight three or to an extent four major strategies, right, within this mission itself. And the first one is the obvious, which is you get the minerals that you have, which is improved domestic, production of these minerals. And in many ways, that has been something India has been lagging on. A lot of this, the exploration has been driven by public sector until recently, and so a bunch of policy reforms, have undertaken to encourage private sector to come in the exploration sector, and so that's one big, feature of the unlocking mechanism. The other is, of course, to also incentivize miners in order to ensure that they can, easily get down to mining. Single window clearance has just been set up. The Ministry of Forest and Climate Change have also said that they've made the processes simpler and easier to fast track these steps. So I think getting mineral processing and mineral exploration up and running quickly within India with the kind of minerals you have, that's the first step, and that's underway. Of course, the ecosystem will take some time to respond, but I think that's part of the process of policy reform. I think the second step is to go abroad, because India doesn't have everything that it needs, especially because it has all of these ambitions with manufacturing clean energy technologies within India, and with that, going into countries like Argentina with a consortium or a joint venture that it has put together called Kabil. I think these are critical steps that it has undertaken. Kabil is also going to undertake offtake measures with existing mines abroad. Coal India, for example, that's another entity that you might think has nothing to do with this entire transition, but now has gotten activated with a similar agenda, right? So it's looking to acquire assets. And so that's another critical step, right, where India does not have minerals. And the third is recycling, I would think, because there's already a bunch of entities recycling critical minerals within India and doing it pretty successfully. Now the question is, what can policy measures do to support this industry to flourish? And in many ways, that's what, again, I think this was yesterday or the day before that we heard about the incentive 1,500 crores that's being provided to incentivize recycling and large-scale recycling this time around of e-waste. So I guess the steps are being undertaken, and in many ways it's being undertaken as we speak. So, but I would think these are the top three major important steps that India's taken, to ensure criticality of these minerals supply chain.
Sure. Thank you so much, Vivek, for highlighting those steps. In fact, I'm really excited to see how the actual action on ground happens on those and how it impacts like the global supply chain. I think linking to this and coming to you, Gaylor, in India, we have limited reserves, but the government is actively trying to give incentives to the mining community to ensure that we are doing much more extraction, but also ensuring the ESG standards. Africa is a home of the world's richest reserves, be it like cobalt in the DRC, and I think platinum metals in South Africa and graphite in Mozambique. Along with that, though in spite of having these reserves, the processing capability or the infrastructural gaps, along with the governance challenge, still exist in Africa. So, how do you see Africa's broader priorities shaping up? And if you could reflect not just from like the supply chain mineral perspective, but also in terms of how it would help like creating domestic local jobs, generating income, and fostering like domestic value addition. And do you think there's any learning or guidance in the new critical mineral strategy that has been released for South Africa, and any learnings for us there?
Yeah, thanks so much, Saloni, for a very pertinent question, and good day, everyone. Really a pleasure to be with you today to contribute to this important discussion. I think The first element from an African perspective is the recognition or the acknowledgement that business as usual is not an option from an African perspective. You said it, Africa has got vast resources of minerals, yet the continent has not benefited. Very few exceptions exist on the continent where there has been truly integration, job creation, and local value capture. The agenda around so-called critical minerals so far has been very one-sided. It has been driven by one issue and one issue only: security of supply for those who need these minerals. And don't get me wrong, this is an important agenda. Without demand, there is no supply. So meeting that demand is important. And we need to meet that demand for the global project of decarbonization and rolling out green technologies. But that cannot be the only lens through which we look at those value chains. From an African perspective, there are two additional levels, certainly, that we look at. One is, how do we deepen those value chains from an African perspective? And that means building local demand for green technologies on the continent. And that is often, for me, a missing element of all the strategies that look at increased beneficiation on the continent. If we want to build value on the continent, we have to create the demand for the final products. That is the only way at the end of the day. We need significant demand for renewable energy across the continent and other green technologies so that we can then build the value chains. Otherwise, we're always going to end up being the suppliers for others. And we need to do that in accordance with the pursuit of a just transition, which means that we need a much bigger strategy. Often, the debates are very simplistic, in my opinion, that one looks at, oh, well, I've got mineral, so I should beneficiate. But what we need is jobs. You said it, how do we create jobs? If one stops at mineral beneficiation, then one is not going to create jobs on a significant level. Mineral beneficiation at its most basic level is capital intensive and energy intensive and virtually doesn't employ anyone. The jobs are in the downstream industries, in the services, in the operation and maintenance of those green technologies. And so, yes to beneficiation, but as a step to a much bigger strategy where we look at creating job-rich activities across manufacturing, across services, in downstream and side stream activities, but also, looking at backward linkages into mining. I think from a South African perspective, there's been a dual strategy, acknowledging that whatever happens at a national level is very intertwined with global dynamics. And so at a national level, there's been a variety of actions to try and really create those benefits. You mentioned it, there is a critical mineral and metals strategy. Again, an important addition there. But we also have developed pretty ambitious master plans around building our renewable energy and battery storage value chains, which is really around understanding where South African industry can play a role in manufacturing and building value chains. But we've done also similar assessment, for instance, across green hydrogen, but also new energy vehicle. And here, my key message is always the same. We need to do our homework because we're not going to do everything. No country in the world will do everything, not even China. Okay, so we need to understand where we have strength, where we can be competitive, and acknowledging that it is difficult to compete on a global scale. It is really difficult. And so one has to really understand where we can be competitive, and we've done a lot of that work, but now we have to take it forward. And then there's been a championing, I think, from a South African perspective of just transition and debates around critical minerals at a global level. And we saw that through the G20 with the development of the critical minerals framework, but also the developments around the African green mineral strategy that puts forward a continental blueprint. And look, we all know implementing something at a continental level is going to be difficult, but at least it provides the direction of travel. It provides a really great diagnostic and some really strong proposals on where to go forward. And to do that in a just transition perspective. And so for me, that has been a really important recognition from a South African and from an African lens that we need to broaden the debate. Yes, meeting demand is important, but we also need to look at rebalancing effectively the interest between consumer countries and producer countries. And that's only through a balanced approach that effectively we're going to have sustainable value chains that benefit for all. You know? And so that has really been the approach at a global level, and trying to take that forward domestically as much as possible.
Perfect. Thank you so much for those comments, valuable insights. No, I think we completely echo with it. You made a point that not every country can do everything. We need to choose our areas and battles. In the last few years, we have seen that there's a very protectionist approach toward critical mineral value chain. But I think what now with the G20 framework, or be it the MSP and Quad or other international platforms, there is recognition that collaboration is the key in terms of achieving the supply chain we want and ensuring that each country gets the required benefit. A key gap that we also see is in terms of skills. So a lot of countries need like mining workers. And for example, we feel that there's a lot of Australian universities where collaboration is possible between the Australia and India University or maybe the US universities on the mining courses. And hence there could be a possibility of co-learning from each other. I think having said that, one geography that I absolutely admire in terms of their developmental journey and also in terms of innovation is Japan. Dr. Nanda, we recognize that Japan has dependency on external sources for meeting its mineral reserves, and there are strategic risks around it. But the country has been able to leverage its technological strength and advanced mineral base. In fact, there have been recent overseas mining projects. The country has been focusing on urban mining and alternate chemistry researches. So just based on your perspective, how do you see that the Japan's policy priorities have evolved in order to secure supply chain for minerals like cobalt, lithium, nickel? And there we have talked about circular economy, we have talked about recycling, but what role do you see of recycling and innovation in terms of strengthening the supply chain? Mehnaz also talked about innovation. If you could shed some light based on Japan's experience.
Thank you, Ms. Sachdeva, and thanks a lot to IEEFA for putting this wonderful panel together. Now, in terms of Japan's, the challenges and opportunities before that, I think like any other country, Japan also faces this trilemma. For example, one side you have emissions. Countries actually have to address the greenhouse gas emissions. And on the other side, how to actually manage these challenges by meeting the 2050 targets of net zero. Now, the third big concern here is dependency on external sources for critical minerals. I think in Japan, that fear and concern about overseas dependence is high, especially because the country has faced some challenges with regard to supply crunches and some instances of geopolitical conflicts reflecting in the trade of critical minerals. So what Japan has been doing over the past few years, you can see that Japan actually has proposed its green transformation strategy. But as green transformation strategy, while on one side its main focus is to meet the 2050 targets, it's also sort of bringing in a sort of more demand for critical minerals, especially if you look at, as you mentioned, Japan actually has been well known as a processing and manufacturing hub. Now, if you look at the manufacturing sector, say passenger cars, by 2030, Japan is trying to have something like 20 to 30% of EVs in all the new sales. Now, the similar trend you can also see in not only in the passenger cars, but also in commercial vehicles and other things. By 2040, all new passenger cars in Japan will have to be, all new cars which are going to be sold will have to be EVs. And by 2050, not only the passenger cars, but also it applies to commercial vehicles and all. So the entire transportation sector is going to change, and this change is definitely going to showcase a lot of demand for critical minerals. The same goes into the case of battery manufacturing. By 2030, Japan is targeting something like 150 gigawatt hour of domestic manufacturing. And Japan also is trying to bring in some investment, which actually they could actually like not only invest in these manufacturing activities, but also in terms of investing in R&D for reducing the dependency on critical minerals and development of alternative technologies. Nevertheless, if you look at Japan's demand, or sorry, Japan dependency on critical minerals, it has the same pattern like many other countries are having. In terms of supplies, most of the supplies are coming from a few countries, which includes Australia, China, and some of the major African players. And only in the case of processing, certain other players are coming in between. But otherwise, most of the industrial activities with regard to critical minerals are actually in this concentrated in certain countries. So Japan is certainly concerned. At the same time, it has limited options in terms of changing this the value chain. Probably Japan's policy, if you look at, I think one of the most interesting elements we can find is that Japan's national strategies are largely aligned with G7 strategies. For example, the recent G7, which is talking about having standard-based markets, basically bringing in rules and regulations for the existing market and trying to develop a global mechanism that heavily dependent on sort of a global norms and regulations. Now, even the 2023, during 2023, Japan was chair of G7. And during that time, Japan also had witnessed G7 coming up with a 5-point agenda, where thrust has been given on areas like recycling, urban mining, innovation, and strengthening resource diplomacy, and etc. Now, these are actually some of Japan's strategies as well. But what you can also see is that Japanese focus on stockpiling as well as recycling is not something new. For example, Japan has a stockpiling strategy which has been there in place from 1983 onwards. And at that time, it actually developed something like stockpiling of 60 days for certain minerals and 30 days for minerals that are easily available. And currently, Japan has about 34 minerals in the CM list. But bigger focus also has been given to recycling and urban mining. And as you know, I think Japan actually traditionally has one of the most efficient recycling practices when you compare with other countries. Some of the cities there's a city in Japan which is called Kamikatsu, which has got about there's a normal practice of even waste processing, solid waste processing. They categorize that waste into 45 different categories, which you can actually see the kind of recycling culture they have. So that is something which Japan has been focusing on. That culture of recycling, efficient recycling, along with advanced technology. And that is exactly what Japan's focus is. In terms of what you could see in the coming years is that Japan will be giving more focus on urban mining and retrieval of critical minerals from appliances and machinery. So these are actually some of the approaches Japan will follow. Largely, you can see that Japanese national policies are in alignment with G7 strategies. I'll stop here.
Perfect. Thank you so much for sharing those insights. In fact, I completely agree with you that innovation, recycling, urban mining, in fact, also stockpiling will define how the next 5 to 10 years of the value chain will develop. In fact, coming to what Mr. Sanjeeva was saying earlier, that being India as the demand center and the manufacturing base, maybe technology collaborations coming from Japan in terms of technology transfer on recycling and processing, US in terms of partnership on exchange and exporting and importing of these minerals, resources coming from Australia. So there are so many different shapes and forms of partnerships that can happen, even just based on the country level discussions we are having today. And with that, it opens up the window for me to bring in the G20 angle, because that is the common discussion that ties all of us together today. The role of cooperations, particularly through G20. Given this unique platform for shaping like collective action, how can G20 strengthen international cooperation while ensuring transparency and supporting the resilient supply chain that we're talking about? Uh, Having said that, I think one common question with country level specificity and nuances would be, how can G20 member countries leverage like complementary strengths that I was just talking about, where Australia and Africa has abundant reserves, China and Japan has the technology on processing and refining and also recycling, US and India has the manufacturing capability and are the demand centers. So maybe starting with you, Mr. Sanjeeva, how do you see the role of G20 to help scale this collaboration, particularly in connecting like the producer countries with the processing and the manufacturing countries, while ensuring that the value addition is diversified and is benefiting everyone, not just like siloed to one or two countries?
Thanks, Saloni. I think the first most important thing to recognize is that we need to understand that there is, of course, a vastly dominant player in the market in China. And, as I said, China is one of our biggest trading partners and one of our most trusted trading partners. But I think what we are seeing is a level of aggregation and bottleneck in some of these supply chains, which is kind of monopolistic in some respects. 85% or more of lithium hydroxide production and carbonate production is coming from China. And that, of course, is a challenge for all of us. So when you say the G20 grouping, I think, like-minded countries who are wanting to add value themselves to some of these supply chains will have to collaborate outside of groupings that involve, China explicitly. But I don't think, this is nothing to detract from the incredible job that China has done to build that dominance. I think what it is saying is that, like any market incumbent, it is not going to give up that dominance without a fight. And so other countries have to decide how we are going to connect. In my view, sort of 5 key elements: the raw materials. So that's where a country like Australia comes into play and is very important. The technology, and I don't mean just the R&D, because a lot of countries will have the R&D, the innovation to be able to do this processing at lab scale. But over the last 15 years, most of the rest of the world has lost the ability to scale critical minerals processing to the kind of scale that would be self-sustaining at a global level. So when I say technology, commercial, like we need people and skills to be able to bring that. We also need workforce. You know, if you look, I saw a wonderful article once about the number of specialized chemical engineers that are required to run a gigascale battery factory in different elements, you know, and it's very significant. If you need, you know, 30 or 40 chemical engineers who are specialized in battery production and have expertise in actually manufacturing batteries at scale, which is a wholly separate thing from just knowing how to do that at a lab scale. You know, you need to plan and decide how that's going to happen. How are those engineers going to be trained? You also need the capital to come together at the right moment in time, because what do I mean by that? You know, I speak to some of our large banks and they would love a viable critical mineral processing value chain to invest in. So it's not the lack of capital, but you know, the thing that they will all ask for in considering any kind of investment is, where's the offtake coming from? And as I said, you know, China has done very well to dominate that offtake market. So you know, it's not an easy thing to secure offtake, and that's coming from an Australian, you know. So because as I said, we are a country that is a free, you know, has operated on in the free market, and so you know, offtake gets tied up for 10 years, 15 years in advance. So you need to work to long time horizons. The last thing that you need is you need to bring all the other elements together, but then you need to know where the market, where the end demand for this processed mineral will come from, who is going to offtake it. And, you know, the synchronization that's going to be required, and this is where groupings like the G20, or I would think the Quad, or other, you know, other groupings will need to come into play, is that it all needs to come together simultaneously. And the final element of the market needs to be considered in light of what is the difference in terms of the lowest value global production currently, and what the you know, what this new supply chain will start to produce at, because governments will need to be involved to both close the capex and opex price difference between global markets. Because obviously, when you're operating at the scale that China is operating at, you can operate at much lower margins. You can have, you know, much lower capital expenditure costs, because you have things, you have various kinds of government support that have facilitated that situation. We need to bring all these elements together at once, and that's where intergovernmental cooperation is necessary. But it's necessary if it's not going to be just theoretical discussion, then it needs to be in the context of someone, a like-minded country, having identified and secured offtake. And that's all a very, you know, tough thing to bring together.
Absolutely tough, but crucial. In fact, in the limited discussions IFA has been having with a lot of global experts, offtake agreements and the demand aggregation has been coming as a key point. So thank you so much for bringing that up. Before I move on to the next panelist, I would request the attendees to please post on to their questions in the Q&A box. We will take them in the Q&A segment in a couple of minutes. Vivek, coming to you, Mr. Sanjeeva talked about offtake. He talked about the 5 or 4 missing pieces in terms of raw material, technology, skill, workforce. How do you see India's role in terms of G20 engagement, and where India can bring in efforts to enhance collaboration, maybe on the standard setting, joint investments, or technology transfer? What do you think can be a priority for India?
Thanks, Saloni. Yeah, I think India's already shown intent on joint investments. I think Sanjeeva kind of alluded to that as well earlier on. And also, I think because we are not as well endowed in terms of minerals, we do imagine that a lot of processing can occur onshore, right? And that could be because India has a lot of advantages in terms of land, labor, renewable energy that's also plentiful now. And so there are those conditions that are, ripe for industrial growth. With some amount of policy reform and ease of doing business, if that was to come into it, we may have really a winning combination. And so processing could really take off in a big way. And I think that's something that India could really, would like to see. Of course, it means that technology needs to come, and I think that's the big gap for India, and joint ventures and willingness of other countries to cooperate and partner up and set up on Indian shores may be something that is a point of discussion. Of course, it has to, again, like I said, the incentives will play a role. How much are we willing to pay the premium for diversity and onshoring? That's going to be an important point of discussion, at least in the short term, right? Because when scale is low, value chains are new, they will have a premium attached to it. So these are questions that need to be addressed, and we are in really early stages of this journey in many ways. But yeah, I think the other point is on standard setting, right? And I think in many ways with the G20 as well, it is a body that will talk about standards and will discuss it. It is part of its mandate in many ways. And so looking at what an equitable setup for critical mineral value chain is would become important, even including traceability standards, mine site practices, and in terms of audits, it's almost something that's extremely new right now. A lot of the practices to self-audit, and so these are maybe not accountability mechanisms need to improve across the supply chain in many ways. And so these are all areas where India can play a role in many ways and should, because the new supply chain could be different from the past, from the point of view that it is better off in terms of sustainability, it's better off in terms of ESG metrics. And I think last is there is also, when you look into the future, a lot of these processes that we're using today will need to change and adapt to climate as well, right? They need to become more energy efficient and less environmentally, because there's a lot of toxins that are coming out that go into rivers and land. And how do we avoid that? And what new processes can be used? So there is going to be a lot of R&D around this, and bringing together universities and technical universities within these different geographies to work on this problem can be important. So ideas like direct recycling, they're already taking root, and there are people working on it. I think the US is leading in many ways. How do we do this across the board, across many geographies, would become important. I think lastly, and I think borrowing Galo's point here, it's very, very important for us to all set targets, right? That demand side, if it isn't activated, the entire supply chain doesn't get activated. And so maybe setting long-term EV targets, RE targets will all help, get the entire value chain together and get all of us to start cooperating more, because then we have an important problem to solve.
Absolutely. In fact, as Mr. Sanjeeva mentioned about like Australia is a market-driven economy and India is a more government top-down driven, and we have a lot of industry-to-industry partnership, G2G partnerships, but we also want government-to-business partnerships going forward. And the challenges you talked about, technology transfer, demand activation, give the required sense of assurance to not just the financing institutes, but also to the demand centers and the industry itself. Uh, Looping in Minas on this, US has been a driving force in building international partnerships, be it the MSP, the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum, Quad, also, and now the G20's partnership. So in your view, how can the G20 help strengthen US bilateral engagements with other countries? And which countries do you see would play the most crucial role in terms of benefiting US in terms of partnership?
I don't like to pick favorites for that question, but I'll talk about it from the US international cooperation on two fronts. So I think many of the participants alluded to the plurilateral frameworks that are at play. So the G7 Critical Minerals Action Plan, That roadmap is being developed at the moment with the G7 partners, but also Australia, India, and Korea. So when you're looking at the G20, 10 of those partners are actively involved in creating this roadmap. And that roadmap really centers around the standard space market, really the sense of what is the true cost of responsible extraction, because we know China is, that's not the true cost of any mineral, right? Because it's heavily subsidized. The second is mobilizing capital and investing in partnerships. And that can be, something that the G20 does as well, beyond the partners that have signed off with this agreement. And then promoting innovation where there's technology and processing gaps. So that's one framework that this administration is really driving the agenda for. With MSP, the politicals are not in place right now for the US government. It's still being invoked by the government, but I think a lot of that work that was originally in MSP, as you know, that was a Biden administration initiative, is going into this G7 Critical Minerals Action Plan. The other one you talked about was Quad, that, we saw a Quad Mineral Initiative that was announced in July. And Quad is a vehicle for the United States for critical minerals diplomacy that was announced on Inauguration Day with the executive order that President Trump released. So that's another vehicle. It looks like it's going to be recovery focused, but it looks like there's still a lot of development that could happen between those four partners. During UNGA, there was the US, Japan, Korea trilateral partnership that was announced. That was interesting because there was a early warning system between those three partners for supply chain disruptions. And those three partners are looking to invest in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. So maybe bringing in the G20 there. I would say what is interesting about this administration and the way we are approaching critical minerals agreements on the bilateral front is that we are not shying away from going into conflict-ridden areas, such as Ukraine and the DRC and Rwanda. Usually you would think that our first engagement would be in these stable, like-minded G20 countries, but it's really taken a different form. And those are mineral deals that are embedded into a larger peace deal, that sort of thing. So we see that work also ongoing. Within the context of the G20, where there's not conflict areas, we saw back in February after Prime Minister Modi's visit, the US-India Strategic Mineral Recovery Initiative that was announced. We also saw in May when President Trump visited Saudi that there was a memorandum of cooperation there for creating these joint ventures for mining, processing. So we see that that's another kind of model that's being developed. And again, during UNGA 2 weeks ago, there was an announcement that our export bank was investing in an Australia critical minerals project. And it was the first time that we've invested in Australia's critical mineral project since 2013. So we see on the bilateral front different types of engagement that's being taken place, whether that's a memorandum of cooperation, whether that's an initiative, whether that's directly investing through our banks. So it remains to be seen what we're going to do. I think we'll still keep engagement on the plurilateral front and see where that roadmap leads for us. But I think that for the G20, if they can build off the G7 critical minerals roadmap, that would be one place to start.
Perfect. I think sounds very interesting, and I've noted all the points you mentioned about standards to cost of responsible extraction. That I find is a really valuable point that we all need to look into. Since we are a little bit over time in terms of, I don't want to miss out the questions that are in the Q&A box, I'll quickly move to Dr. Nanda. Thank you for answering the question in the box already. Just listening to other speakers, what do you think is Japan's perspective in terms of the leadership in harmonizing ESG standards and promoting innovation through G20? If you could allude on that a little bit.
Thank you, Saloni. In fact, the G20's efforts in shaping the roadmap is something really promising, because what we have before us as critical minerals is nothing but oil of the century. So critical mineral is sort of the new oil, as we always say. Now, that means critical minerals is not only about the challenges associated with the critical minerals are not only about its supplies or processing, I mean, there's a whole list of various challenges are important when you look at the key issues in the sector. And if you see the critical minerals have already created new alliances, relations, economic dependencies, geopolitical conflicts, everything. So whatever the oil industry has done earlier, it's sort of replicating in this in the critical mineral industry also. Now, when you look at the challenges associated with the sector, as I mentioned, there are certainly environmental challenges, social challenges, and economic and technological challenges. And most of those challenges are also sort of further aggravated by cross-cutting issues in terms of gender, equity, and agri-food issues and everything. So first approach probably countries will have to look at is that instead of looking at these issues in silos and addressing these issues specific to what is important for one, there is a global mechanism is really needed. And I think Japan's approach is favoring a global effort. For example, something similar to a large-scale multi-stakeholder global mechanism that not only looks at the supplier-related issues, but also about environmental issues, gender issues, and associated all those issues. So probably something like what Japanese perspective is to basically have something sort of a global mechanism where probably you can think of something like a Paris Agreement for critical mineral or something similar to that. I think from that perspective, I believe that G20's efforts in terms of shaping a broader framework is definitely important. I think most of the people who are actually even in this platform, even in this today's discussion, and those who have been associated with the G20 in one or the other ways in the past several years, most of us must have noticed that there has been a continuous push for such a global mechanism. So I believe G20's efforts in this direction is important, and that's the same actually when Japan is expecting to have. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Nanda. Quickly, Mr. Gaylor, coming to you. As the chair of the Task Force 5 of the T20, what key proposals that you feel are essential for championing the whole of society and whole of economy just transition? If you could take a minute. And meanwhile, if there is any response from any of the panelists on the questions in the Q&A box, please feel free to answer them. Else we will spend a minute after Mr. Gaylor's comment.
Sure. Look, the first thing is to recognize how, excuse the pun, critical the G20 is. It is effectively the only forum where consuming and producing countries are gathered together. And so I think the initiative of the presidency in negotiating a critical minerals framework as part of the G20 is fundamental. And I think it is the beginning of a long-term process, of course. This is the first time that the G20 looks at those issues in a meaningful way. We can't expect 1 year of negotiations to solve all the problems. So it is going to be part of a journey. There's 6 areas that the critical minerals framework of G20 is trying to tackle. And I think we need to push on the 6. And I know we don't have time to go into the 6 of them right now, but just maybe allow me a minute to go through these 6 areas very briefly, because it's really important. First one is around mapping and exploration, acknowledging that, again, from a global south perspective, there's underserved of exploration, particularly from an African perspective, and that we need to do a lot more in that respect. And so having funds to do that, and I make sure that the programs and the various strategies are compatible. Secondly, we've spoken about it quite a lot already today, governance and standards to rebalance, again, because standards and frameworks and rules that govern value chains right now determined by countries in the global north and increasingly a bit from China. But everyone else really doesn't have a say. And it's really important that we rebalance that so that everybody's got to say how we have that critical minerals governance. 3, around investment and towards value addition and local development. That is something that we've spoken about. It's been recognized as a key issue in the G20, and I think all members have recognized the need to do that to strengthen supply chains. 4, resilient and diversified supply chain overall, particularly around trade corridors to reduce bottlenecks and any sort of supply pressures. That is something that, again, would service both producers and consumers to make sure that trade flows a lot better and there's more transparency around what happens in terms of that. 5 is innovation and circularity and technology. And that speaks to partnership. If one wants to go about developing capabilities, given the overwhelming domination of China on the one end, and the sort of critical mass of intellectual property that sits in the global north, partnerships are going to be critical in terms of driving that innovation. And then the 6th pillar is on skills and knowledge. And again, that I think around how we build those partnerships, I think between the countries in the global south, but also, of course, between global south and global north, and with China in the middle, because China is that dominating power that we all have to contend with, I think is important. And so those 6 areas for me are really important to broaden the agenda to a whole of economy and all of society, to build value chains that are not just about mining effectively, but are really about the complete ecosystem and broader strategies that benefit all going forward. In the interest of time, I'll leave it at this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gaylor. I think this is such interesting conversation that no amount of time is ever enough for it. Thank you so much for speakers already answering the questions. I know, Dr. Nanda, you're already answering one of the question. Maybe one that is not answered, I'll just pick it up, which says, as manufacturing operations for clean energy technology scale, which specific recycling technology do you believe offers the highest economic value and should be prioritized for domestic developments for both the government and private players? If any speaker wants to take this up. But I think I just would like to add a comment that there is still a lot of research happening in terms of making the recycling technology economical. There are examples in India with industries like Atero and Lohum who have doing active lithium and other mineral recycling. But as Vivek mentioned in his comments, scaling up will require a lot of policy support, financial support, R&D, demand centers. So because we know at present, we don't even have the required quantum available to do the recycling. So all of these different aspects will make that decision. But if any other speaker wants to add to it, else I would then close the webinar in terms of the discussion and then request my colleague Kyra for the closing remarks. Any speaker, any last comments?
Saloni, one quick point is that I think for the recycling, it is not only about the recycling technology per se, but there has to be an ecosystem developed, and that ecosystem should go beyond the technology. Probably it must start with the culture of collecting e-waste and having adequate laws and regulations in place in a society, and then having supporting industries to operate all this. So in my view, which I can actually see from Japan, is that there needs to be a recycling ecosystem must be developed, and probably we must also look at from that ecosystem perspective when we think of recycling and urban mining. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nanda. I absolutely agree with you. And a huge thank you to all the speakers for your insightful reflections. This truly has been an enriching and rich discussion. There were a lot of key takeaways, which we will compile and convert it into a document and share with all of you out there. With that, I will now request my colleague, Ms. Kyra Rakheja, for her closing remarks and summarizing the key takeaways.
Sure.
Over to you, Kyra. Thanks, Saloni, and thank you so much to all our distinguished speakers and the participants for being part of today's session. And I think today's discussion has underscored this key message, just as Mr. Gaylor said, that secure supply chains cannot be achieved in isolation. How we govern, how we trade, how we collaborate on these resources, it will define what the resilience of our shared future will be. I think some of the key takeaways on a theme level are that, of course, these international forums like the G20 are vital because we have so many national strategies that are very diverse. And to have a shared vision for the sustainable and secure mineral supply chain is key. Secondly, we have to also keep in mind that while we are scaling, this has to go hand in hand with responsibility. Local communities need to create the demand, they need to benefit, and we have to make sure that these environmental standards are upheld. Just these rich resource countries have to be able to move up the value chain and not be confined to extraction. And lastly, diversification is just not about the policies, it's also about the trust. We have to have reliable supply chains, which means that we have to have sharing of skills, of technology, we have to have transparency, and we have to think long term when it comes to our collaboration. As we move forward, IEEFA is going to be engaging with partners like the T20 to explore these pathways to create secure mineral supply chains that have to be not only resilient, but also future ready. At the moment, we are engaged in work that examines India's critical mineral landscape and how geopolitical partnerships and diversified supply chains can strengthen the country's long-term energy security. So insights from discussions like these actually directly inform the work that we are doing and help shape the policy frameworks that we advocate for. We'd also like to invite everyone, the attendees as well, to continue to stay connected with IEEFA and follow our upcoming webinars, reports, and policy briefings as we continue to examine the financial and policy dimensions of the global energy transition. On behalf of the entire team, I'd like to sincerely extend my gratitude to everyone who joined us today for their time, for their insights, and of course to our partners at the T20 for their collaboration. So we look forward to the continued engagement and as we work towards a better future. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Kyra. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.